I want to thank you, Abigail and Joy and Mikhail Brownell for bringing me down. I'm really excited to be here. Um, this is my old stomping grounds. I grew up nearby. I'm going to talk a little bit about growing up around here. Um, see if we can move to the next slide. But first, I just am going to read this land acknowledgement. While we are here together, I would like to acknowledge the traditional stewards of this land, the Wampanoag Nation. And from where I sit in Vermont, it's the Abenaki, the Western Abenaki. I acknowledge the violent land taking in the past and buried stories that hopefully will resurface. We are all visitors here. We honor with gratitude the generations of indigenous people that came before us and live among us still. And I speak with the hope that when we work with the land, we come from a place of listening to and collaborating with tribal people in the spirit of co-authorship and partnership. So these maps show the traditional lands of the Wampanoag Nation. And Sakonnet is right in the middle of that. Cape and Islands. It's a very rich heritage. So what are we going to talk about tonight? What ground are we going to try to cover? Well, we are going to visit the marsh. We're going to, the book I wrote is now 15 years old. And I just want to remind everybody I'm a writer, not a scientist. And so I'm probably better at listening. My work as a writer is often in nonfiction where I'm interviewing people and listening and trying to get their story straight. So I'm less experienced in talking about my work, but I'll do the best I can. So we will go back to Sipwasit Marsh and we'll actually work our way down there following one thread of evolving stewardship science, because there is a story, Sipwasit fits into a journey really of science down in Woods Hole. And there is a personal aspect to it. So we'll touch on that briefly. And finally, I would like to briefly imagine the future and talk about it in the context of work that I'm beginning to do, that's focused more on the islands that we know close to the mainland, including Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and Block Island, the Elizabeth Islands, Quidnick Island. And but I want to talk with you about the future of stewardship. This is a really interesting time we live in with climate change and social upheaval and social change. I mean, right today we have the George Floyd trial going on and Black Lives Matter confronting white supremacy, systemic racism. We have a very divided country. And we also have the emerging voices of BIPOC communities. And that's all very exciting. And I think there is a tie-in. More and more of the social movement is looking at models in nature to design those social movements. We have emergent strategies going on, and I want to talk just a little bit about that towards the end. I don't know how many of you saw the program that Christine DeLucia gave as part of the annual meeting speaker for the association in 2019. I found it profound and just incredibly informative. One of my takeaways was this idea of Algonquin memory cairns, this idea of marking important memories, significant places, people, events with piles of stones that that Native people, indigenous groups would add to over time, as if to honor the past and to remember the important stories. So I'm going to borrow a little bit of that in my personal place-making journey. I think stewardship is about connecting to where we live, and that makes it a kind of personal story for all of us. Knowing who we are is partly about knowing where we're from and knowing the land around us and knowing the important stories, our own stories and the stories of the people before. Um, so my own kind of journey into this world of stewardship work and conservation work. Um, by the way, this is a photo of Norman Bird Sanctuary. Let's see. This, here's another shot of the Norman Bird Sanctuary, Hanging Rock, Bishop Barclay's seat there at Second Beach. But I was born in Barrington, and some of the first stones of my journey towards a stewardship ethic and work really were there. We lived near Narragansett Bay shores and swam and boated in the bay, but we also lived near Barrington River. And in many ways, fish figure in big time, and fishing into my development as someone interested in nature and learning about it. And then trying to do something to protect the natural world. So fishing, we would catch all kinds of fish out of the Barrington River, and I could always bring those fish to my mother, and she would fix them for us, whether it was spring flounder or tautog, or in some cases, in one case anyway, eel. I have a very vivid memory of my mother skinning an eel over her sink, and I think she had a little book in front of her that was an instruction manual for how to skin an eel. And we ate that eel for dinner, and it was really very good. It tastes like chicken. Of course, eel is a really popular food in Europe, but it isn't as much in this country. So skinning eels was definitely a memory marker for me. There's also a bluefish that figures into an important part of my history. It enabled me to go to summer camp for a month, a sleepover camp. And the story is that my brother and his friend were out in our little Starcraft boat in the Barrington River catching bluefish. And when they got back to the dock, they were horsing around and throwing bluefish at each other up onto the dock. And my brother caught a bluefish, a spine of a dorsal fin in his elbow, and it penetrated into his elbow. And it required some emergency surgery to get it out. So he got X'd off the go to camp list, and I got to go. And we still joke about that. But so fishing always plays a role, I think. Anyway, at about the age of 14, I began to volunteer at the Norman Bird Sanctuary for the director at the time, who was Lee Gardner, a wonderful, wonderful man, and his wife Polly and their family. And Lee had a bird banding license. So he'd take us all over, a little banding crew, and we would go out to Snake Island or Gould Island in the Sakonnet and band out there in the spring. And I just remember climbing up these slimy, slippery, guano-encased trees and getting these black-and-white night herons out of these stick nests and carefully dropping them down. And then we band and climb them back up. Very vivid. You don't forget stuff like that. It's important not to. We also visited the little piles of rocks off Warren's Point and banded gulls and terns out there. I'm not sure if that was West Island or one of your properties, but we also brought home gull eggs and cooked them up into gull omelets. We were assured this was okay from a conservation standpoint. I don't remember what species of gull it was, probably great blackback gulls, but vivid memories of this place. My wife and I started running the sanctuary in 1980. We were there for 5 years. The Providence Journal asked me to write these columns for them. So that was the beginning of my writing career for smaller newspapers. And so that stayed with me throughout my career, writing on the side. what else at the bird sanctuary? I want to mention one other stone that I think was important and significant. In '85, before we left, and I went back to graduate school, we convened a really interesting meeting of neighborhood people. Mr. Alexander was there. Many of people who lived around the bird sanctuary, but there were folks from Newport and Portsmouth. And the whole idea, we had a weekend-long meeting with a fellow named Robert Lemire, who had written this important book on creative land development and land trusts. And at the end of that weekend, we all decided we needed to have a land trust. So that was the very beginning of Aquidneck Land Trust. And it was chartered either in '85, I think at the very end of the year, the first annual meeting occurred. I moved away, but I think, and that surprised me that you all had formed your land trust so much earlier. I thought we were among the first, but no way. You guys had us beat by a number of years. Sometimes we got really tired of the crowds on Aquidneck Island in the summer, so we would run off to Sakonnet and ride our bikes and have ice cream and go to Goosewing Beach and Quicksand Pond. Sometimes we'd go over and birdwatch in the winter in Tiverton and look for brant geese. And maybe this is the root of the word Sakonnet. I'm not sure. But brant geese, black goose, certainly dark. And as Ralph Waldo Emerson points out, language really does come from the land. One of the little pieces I wrote for the journal, Providence Journal, was about Wilbur Woods. I tried to find that so I could see the headline and read that again. I couldn't locate it, but I came over to Little Compton and went for a walk in Wilbur Woods with my 2-year-old daughter, and then wrote a piece about that. I think the point is that, you know, our ancestral lands, our childhood memories, our visits to special places, summer places, whether it's a Sippowisset Marsh or a Wilbur Woods, ultimately protected by people who really love and care for places like that, they're really important. Here's a book. This fellow, Thomas McGuane, one of my favorite writers, this is a book of essays of his, The Longest Silence. And I wanted to read a little piece. Apparently he summered in Sakonnet. He lives out in Montana. He's best known as a fishing writer, but he's written 10 novels. He's an important voice. And he writes this little piece called Sakonnet. And it's about coming back to Little Compton after being away for many, many years. Maybe somebody in the room knows this family, but apparently his uncle was a judge in Fall River. And he just has these beautiful, fond memories of Sakonnet. I'm just going to read a very brief paragraph from his essay. He says that when you go back to a place where you spent many hours of childhood, you find that some of it has become important, if not actually numinous, and that universal irony might just have to eat hot lead for the moment, because there is no way of suppressing that importance. So childhood memories, places really stay with us, and they're important memories. He goes on to say, the smallness of that which is revisited, and he's talking about Sakonnet, Little Compton, is one of the touchstones of an underground literature in which the heart is constantly wrung by the artifacts of childhood. So I think we probably, all of us, have some writers we like that go back in time to their childhood and remember these places, and that it brings them maybe back to life. So if anybody would, I'd love to have you use the chat function, and maybe we could share some words that describe your physical setting, or you could think of, you know, your memory cairns. What special places come to mind when you think of home? Where would you put your memory cairns?
Whilst people are doing that, we've got a couple of people have answered your question from earlier. He owns a home at Sakonnet Point now. He's Fred Torfey's cousin. 2 people have said that. So
awesome.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you very much. It's great to know. All right, well, I'm ready to switch gears a little bit here. And I want to talk about stewardship. Could have just mentioned my own personal journey in this work and in this sense of place. I mean, I moved away from Newport back in 1985, Middletown actually, and really haven't been back, been living in Vermont for the last 35 years. So, but have been involved in stewardship work in one way or another. It's a really interesting word. The first time I was introduced to the roots of the word, I was told it was from the Norse, from stu vard, household and guard or keeper, and that it was described as the steward was the person who kept the mead hall stocked with mead and meat. So it's easy to go from that idea to the stewardship of the land. I think of it as the people, the person, the process of making sure that the land, the abundance making of the land, the capacity of that land to produce abundance is protected. Now, you don't destroy your soil or pollute your air or kill all the animals that feed you. And of course, we didn't invent, the English didn't invent the whole concept of land stewardship. The Wampanoag and their ancestors and the first people, the indigenous generations upon generations that visited here, some say as far back as 10,000 years ago, we're practicing a kind of stewardship and sustainability. And I like this Chief Massasoit's comment about private property, doubting whether land can or should be owned by an individual. The earth, he says, for the land is our mother, nourishing all her children, beasts, birds, fish, all men, woods and streams and women. Everything on it belongs to everybody and is for the use of all. Well said. And those of us in the land trust world know that though we swim, that's the ocean we swim in, which is this interplay between private rights and public rights, public lands and private lands. And it's a constant conversation. So if we go to the Anglo idea of stewardship, this person from our town, actually, George Perkins Marsh, who wrote Man and Nature, where physical geography is modified by human action, wrote a very important book. That date is wrong. It was actually 1854. But he's considered by many to be the starting point, the fountainhead of the American conservation movement. We always learned that he was sort of the utilitarian, branch, but it's a thread that I think takes us right down to Sippowiset Marsh and to Woods Hole. So I just want to follow that out a little bit. I also want to, we saw a bird's eye view earlier, drone footage. This is another bird's eye view. It shows that the forests have been almost completely removed from George Perkins Marsh's hometown, which is Woodstock, Vermont. And he observed what happened when that happened. Not only the loss of species that live in forests, deer, moose, turkey, lots of loss of biodiversity or changes, but also there were huge impacts on rivers and water bodies, a lot of erosion, drought and flood with rapid runoff in the spring, and then no recharge from groundwater later in the year. So he wrote a lot about this relationship between forests and waters, and I really think it's sort of the heart of the thesis of the book is around that. And it does relate to the marsh in a way. Marshes too are at the confluence of land and shallow coastal ecosystems, estuaries, and they're mediators of chemistry and of all kinds of things that then go on in estuaries, and we'll get to that in a bit. But if you ever come to Woodstock, definitely go visit the Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historic Park. It's a 500-acre preserve with old carriage roads, and mansion, go into the mansion and see the art collection, Lawrence Rockefeller, and learn about the history of stewardship. This is Marsh's book here, and this is in Gifford Pinchot's office and library at Grey Towers, which was his family ancestral home. Actually, this is a book Gifford Pinchot gave to his brother. Can't remember his brother's name, but Gifford's father was a friend of Marsh's and a real believer in what Marsh was talking about. Gifford has often said that it was his father that really should be given credit for the formation of the U.S. Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt. Gifford was the first chief there, and it's fun to see the book traveling like this. And, you know, the Forest Service and the vision and mission of the Forest Service is as much about protecting water resources as about protecting forests.
Excuse me, Tim.
Yeah, sure.
Somebody has their hand up, Frances.
Okay.
Preston.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how to get her in to ask her question. Frances.
Oh, I see. She's got a hand up there. Yeah. If she unmutes, can you unmute her, or she could unmute herself?
Yeah.
She might. It might be a mistake. I don't know. Is that? Anyway.
Oh, I see. Yep, there she is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a mistake. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Not at all. Look, this is a new world. We all make mistakes in these kinds of presentations, but thank you. So Spencer Fullerton Baird, he's sort of why we could even kind of have a Sipawissat study area. Good friend of George Perkins Marsh. Their wives were really close friends. He gets appointed first director of the U.S. Fish Commission in 1870, gets down to Woods Hole and sets up shop to study fish declines in southern New England and to collect species new to science throughout Cape Cod Bay and the Atlantic and Buzzards Bay. And they have fish traps, and he's working with this guy Verrill, and they're just, you know, Baird was essentially a collector right out of this sort of mold of the late 19th century morphologist. And he became ultimately the second director of the Smithsonian. But at the time that he was sent down to run the Fish Commission without a salary, he was the assistant to the first director. Quite an incredible guy, just amazing. He's got two birds named after him, Baird sparrow and a shorebird, Baird sandpiper. Real hero, and the inspiration for the Marine Biological Lab, the MBL. Many of you, I'm sure, know the MBL. Marine Biology, this is the first director, Charles Otis Whitman. The MBL brought scientists and students of marine biology down to Woods Hole for summers of learning in classes and doing their own research. Everyone had their own, initially and early on, everyone had their own organism to learn about and study. Rachel Carson's was the American eel, to hit back on that theme of eels, which I have a real soft spot for eels. And they're having a really rough time actually right now. American eels really on the downward trend. Nobody really knows why. So the Marine Biological Lab, inspired by Baird in part. One of the papers I love from Whitman is his argument for the biological farm. He thought that it was difficult to bring and keep alive these critters from the marsh and from the bay into the lab to keep them alive. And he thought what was needed was a living laboratory outside, a natural area that was functioning, you know, as an ecosystem that could be studied, where animals could be studied in situ, the biological farm. And I think in many ways that Sipawissat became that kind of place. This is from their archive, MBL's familiar seal, the two facing seahorses. I was hoping this might be like a picture of a class. And I hope that because there's so many women in the picture, and this is a field that until more recent times was pretty devoid of women. It was mostly old white guys with really big beards and big brains. I mean, they were very smart, but it's good to see so many women there as well. And it may be that the other institution there, just to go back and mention this briefly, is, okay, so the Penakees Island School, Little Penakees Island, I guess one of the Elizabeth Islands, but just off the Elizabeth Islands, off Noshawn, for a very short period of time, 2 years, harbored a school for natural science teachers that Louis Agassiz set up and ran. His son ran it for a year. He passed away, I think, maybe after a year of the school. But it could be that group, and that was equally men and women. And it could be that this is a picture from the school. I don't know. Here's Rachel Carson, and this is my family. This is my mom with the Cape Cod sweatshirt on, and my sisters, 3 sisters, and then my wife at the end on the right. We always go down and sit with Rachel and take in the vibe, the beautiful, wonderful, world-changing vibe of Rachel Carson, who really changed the face of environmental science. So one thing about Rachel is that she had not seen the ocean before 1929 and 1932. This was her first time being near the ocean, and it must have been just hugely inspiring because she went on to write the famous, ocean trilogy, and is always now associated with that, and with her book, A Silent Spring, of course. Real hero. So many amazing people came through the MBL, and won, fame for their research, whether it was in genetics or physiology, or increasingly in the sort of applied sciences of marine sciences. So everything has been sort of uncovered down there over the years. And for about 90 years, the marsh was visited by these cohorts of summer scientists as part of their invertebrate biology class. So the MBL then evolved to create this ecosystem center in 1975. And it's an ecosystem center that's done, along with BU's Marsh program, done a lot of the science at Sipawicet Marsh over the years. And scientists, by the time that the ecosystem came online in 1975, knew that to monitor conditions in the natural world, you had to set up very long-term studies. Couldn't just be a one-off, 1 year, 2 years. You had to set down studies, plots, and study systems that could last for 25 or 40 years. And that's so true in climate science, of course. You really need to, to see trends, you need to be looking for long periods of time, whether it's at oil spill impacts or climate change. Also, what was going on was there was this new field of molecular biology that was taking off, gene sequencing, all kinds of things. And a lot of work has been done in the marsh and in marshlands in general of late, sequencing microbes to figure out exactly what they do. So it's about trying to determine functionality. So going up to the landscape scale, as big as world and climate and ocean studies to the very smallest parts of life. And that it needed to be multidisciplinary. Scientists needed to talk to each other, since marshes, again, at that interface between land and coastal waters, are places where biology, chemistry, geology all come together. And then, of course, with stewardship, always the problem solving, picking up something that's wrong and trying to restore balance or diversity or health. So, and I think that's an important idea, this idea of restoration. Years and years and years ago, I used to subscribe to Restoration and Management Notes, which was primarily about prairie restoration, a lot of Midwestern studies on how to rebuild and restore prairie. The same kinds of tools and thinking have gone into trying to restore marshlands. And there are many threats to them, including subsidence. And so the early researchers at Sipawicit were really focused on trying to establish functionality and establish economic value. So this is when the fertilizer plots went in to try to quantify what actually marshes do to sequester nutrients that are polluting shallow coastal waters. There were a few laws that protected marshes before the 1970s. 20% had been filled or drained or otherwise destroyed. And there was this problem of community values being superseded by private value. And so there's always the social, political context. These are some of the obvious values, things we know that most of us sort of just intuitively know, that there's storm damage protection and flood control. The hurricane in 1954 blew through our community and through the marsh, and there was a big storm surge. The marsh, I think, saved a lot of houses. There was massive flooding that occurred. Our house flooded. I was brought up to higher ground. I think I was about 6 months old. We know that marshes produce shellfish and that they're vital migratory feeding and nesting areas. Fish nurseries, buffering pollutants. They're edible, beautiful, fascinating. I knew this marsh, by my stomach and mouth more than anything, in terms of clamming and cohogging out there and fishing and just having fun, swimming. So when I began to read the scientific papers, and that was with some stress and difficulty, I began to get the whole view of what a marsh was. So there are two take-homes really from Sipawicit. Much was studied, much was learned about how marshes function and what goes on in that black box, in the muds and layers of sediment that we can't see very well. But it turns out marshes are really vital as areas that deal with excess nitrogen running off land. And that they also do produce surplus of protein in the form of fishes. They send fish out into deeper water. Marshes are warmer and provide breeding and escape habitat for a lot of fishes. So fishes from the deeper water come in and breed, and the young are raised part of the time there. There are also fish that live in the marsh and never make it out to deeper water. But salt marshes contribute significantly to ocean fisheries. Just a little story. It's difficult when you're not a scientist, to be writing about science and studying, reading papers that are chemistry when you're not a chemist. And this could lead to some problems with the people you were writing about, calling you out. You had to get the facts right. And I think I learned that over time, how important that was. But I remember in one instance, I'd written a chapter about the work of Lynn Margulis. And when my book was ready to come out on Chelsea Green Press, she was also writing a book that was coming out on Chelsea Green Press. And the editor thought, why don't you show Lynn Margulis what you're doing? She'd be interested, and I'm sure she'll give you some good advice. Well, I said, fine, that's good. And I did appreciate her input, but my paper or my chapter came back just covered in red ink. And so I had to address many of her concerns. some of which I didn't always agree with, but she ultimately made the chapter a much better chapter. And I wished I'd done that with some of the other scientists I was privileged to be working with. So I want to switch gears again here, and this is Noshawn Island. And I don't know how we're doing on time. We okay? Abigail, good. So let me try to wrap things up a little bit with some thoughts about the future. This is Stone House. It's a house that was actually designed by Ralph Waldo Emerson for his son-in-law and his daughter. The son was one of the Forbeses, William Hathaway Forbes, who's the son of John Murray Forbes, the original benefactor to the family trust of the Noshawn Island and some of the Elizabeth Islands. The Forbes family has in trust. It's a wonderful house. It's a big mansion. It overlooks Hadley's Harbor. You can see the little cupola up top there. You can climb up there. You get a beautiful view of the harbor at sunset. And I, for the last 10 years, have been taking part in a writer's workshop there as part of the staff. And that means I think of myself as the steward, the steward. So I make the fires in the morning and at night and keep the house stocked in firewood. I serve the drinks, you know, when the day is closing. And I cook in the kitchen. I prepare breakfast early in the morning. I also get to read people's work and share my work. So it's good for me, and I hope it's good for them. There's so much to say about this model that I think there's something about the trust in Noshawn and how the Elizabeth Islands are cared for that is worth remembering and knowing about. It's been in the family nearly 200 years. And family members don't own, you know, the land. It's owned by a trust. They can make decisions about it together. They can use it. They can try to restore it. They can try things. It's an experimental place. I think of it that way. Now, of course, long before their ownership, it was home ground for Native people, as were all the islands we're able to see and navigate to easily within 20 miles or so of land. So that has to be said as well. And they had domestic servants and all. I mean, these were oil merchants, and but their ethic towards the land, their use of the land, their love of this place is a powerful, powerful reminder of what can be done when we begin to think differently and creatively about preserving our ties and the productivity and magic of landscape. When I first came out to Noshawn, it was as a guest. I was given a house, working on a book. I was given a small house by a family member on Hadley's Harbor in late October for 3 weeks, actually. And I got to live out there and work on this book I was working on. And one day I walked all the way down to the west end of Noshawn, and because I'd never been down there. This is the west end. This is Crescent Beach, and there's Ram's Head, which is a headland not far from there. And from that headland, I could look over my right shoulder and see Black Beach and where Sippawisset would be. And then looking down southwest, right down the center of the bay, I could see your coastline, I could see New Bedford, and I could see the towers of the Mount Hope Bridge. Actually, it was an incredibly clear day, and by some some strange quality of air and light, I could see all the way down to Block Island. And it was really a remarkable view. And behind me was Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. And I had lived on all these islands. I lived on Block Island and worked for the Nature Conservancy to write a management plan for the Lewis Dickens farm back in the 80s. I'd lived on Nantucket working for a fisherman for 3 seasons. And of course, Aquidneck Island, and now this growing relationship with Noshawn as a visitor to Noshawn. And so I began to think about this view more recently as I was putting this talk together. And I realized that these islands are kind of they're like memory cairns in many ways. They're big piles of stone that were pushed up by a glacier and that receded some 10,000 years ago. And they were like the boundary markers of habitat, or for those of us who live along this coast and who get in boats and go out to the islands. They're these sentinel stones, and they're place markers, boundaries of home. Each one of these islands, I can say from experience, for most of them, not so much Martha's Vineyard, but they're really unique. Each one is really different. The people are different, the customs, the culture of the island, the physiography of the island, the layout. They all have similar traits. Most have bluffs somewhere. Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Block Island certainly do. And we know that they're they're vulnerable to climate change. Bluffs are eroding at very rapid rates. Storm frequencies and strength much higher over the last 20 years, and that seems to be a trend that's getting worse. Climate change threatens them. Block Island's harbor would be gone without too big an increase in sea level. And they're just very vulnerable. And they're also incredibly adaptive places, unique. I think islands, maybe more than mainland places because they're so cut off, have to be places of experimentation and collaboration. Little islands, little worlds apart. So I think of this time we're in, and it's definitely a time of transformation. It's the restorative time, a learning time, a time to listen to new voices, a paradigm shifting time. We are confronting climate change, but also systemic racism. It's a time of political division. So, tremendous challenges. Patterns of inequity that are finally, I think, being surfaced. Injustice, longstanding lack of fairness to BIPOC communities, Indigenous, Black, people of color. I think it's a time, I feel very hopeful in that what I'm reading and seeing, particularly when I'm reading Black voices, learning more about, I'm just learning. It's a learning time. It's really a listening time and a learning time. And I feel a lot of hope around, the ability to face down these challenges and to come out stronger. And I think a real key to that is finding ways to make social movements and environmental movements come together and work together and collaborate. It's a very interesting trend. This book I've been reading by Adrienne Mary Brown, it's called Emergent Strategy. But essentially, it's an argument that says social movements need to try a lot of different things. They need to be like little islands in a way, with all kinds of experimentation rather than the sort of one mass movement. And they need to mirror processes that are found in nature. That's the emergent part. It's very wonderful and interesting. She's talking about, and many in these movements are talking about the preservation of the world, the natural world, in the same breath that they're talking about the need to deal with white supremacy and inequities of all kinds perpetrated against BIPOC people. So I think it's very exciting. It's where I want to spend time. I think it's a very fertile conversation that's going on. Our little communities can be experimental places like salt marshes and islands. And I think if we really know them and love them and trust ourselves, we can create a better future. So that's where I want to end things. I have one more slide actually that I will show. I always forget to put it up. One of the things I love about Noshawn is the beech forests, and here's a beech. It doesn't look in great shape, but many of the beaches out there are in much better shape than our beaches. And islands, I think, have a kind of restorative nature to them.